Arben, Dritan, and Elira, three names that London streets will never forget. Behind the calm neighborhoods and bustling city life, these Albanians quietly built an empire, reshaping the city's drug trade with a precision and silence no one saw coming. In the early 2000s South, London's streets were alive with a chaotic mix of gangs rivalries and the constant hum of the city's underworld. Amid this turmoil, a new presence quietly began to emerge: groups of Albanian criminals who had crossed the continent with one goal in mind: to carve a place for themselves in the city's drug trade. Unlike the loud, violent gangs that often made headlines, these newcomers preferred to remain in the shadows. They did not arrive with flashy displays of power or sudden acts of aggression. Instead, they moved slowly, observing, analyzing, and learning. They settled in modest apartments in overlooked neighborhoods, far from the prying eyes of the media and police. These flats, often small and unassuming, served as their initial headquarters, a place where they could plan without attracting attention. The men and women involved were disciplined, carefully maintaining normal appearances. To outsiders, they appeared as ordinary workers or students, blending seamlessly into the bustling city. But behind closed doors, strategies were being crafted, maps studied, and potential contacts evaluated. They were patient, understanding that success in London's underworld would require more subtlety than brute force. During this early period, the Albanians made no immediate moves to seize territory or challenge established gangs. Instead, they focused on gathering intelligence. They tracked the movements of drug shipments, identified weak points in security, and studied how local gangs conducted their operations. This patience was unusual in London's criminal scene, where impulsive violence often dictated who thrived and who fell. By remaining unnoticed, the Albanians gained a unique advantage. They could watch and learn without provoking retaliation. At the same time, they began establishing connections with small-time dealers and local couriers. These individuals were the first links in what would become a vast, intricate network. Relationships were built slowly, often through small favors or discreet introductions. The Albanians understood the importance of trust, knowing that loyalty could not be bought with intimidation alone. Every alliance was calculated, every connection carefully tested, and every interaction meticulously observed. This approach allowed them to operate under the radar, avoiding unnecessary exposure while gradually extending their influence. Their presence was barely felt on the surface of London's streets. To the average Londoner, life continued as usual. Drugs were sold, conflicts erupted, and the city's criminal landscape remained chaotic. Yet beneath this familiar chaos, a quiet transformation was beginning. The Albanians were not just participating in the trade. They were studying it, learning its rhythms, weaknesses, and opportunities. Their disciplined, methodical approach was a stark contrast to the unpredictable nature of the gangs around them. By the end of this initial phase, the Albanians had laid the groundwork for a sophisticated operation. They had established safe houses, identified potential suppliers, and begun creating a hidden network of contacts across the city. No one in London's law enforcement or criminal circles fully understood the significance of their presence yet. The gang's strength lay not in violence, but in its ability to remain unseen, to move through the city like ghosts, quietly mapping out a future empire. They began the slow and deliberate process of building a network that would form the backbone of their operation. Unlike many gangs that relied on intimidation or brute force, their strategy was rooted in subtlety, patience, and precision. They understood that in a city as vast and complex as London, power could not be seized overnight. It had to be cultivated quietly through relationships, trust, and carefully chosen allies. They started by observing local patterns of drug distribution, noting which neighborhoods were profitable, which suppliers were reliable, and which law enforcement units were most active. Every detail was recorded, analyzed, and used to plan the next move. The Albanians targeted people who were often overlooked by larger gangs. Small-time dealers, couriers, and even those who were barely involved in the criminal world but could be persuaded to participate. These individuals became invisible links in a growing chain, carrying packages, providing information, and running errands that seemed insignificant but were crucial to the overall operation. By recruiting locals rather than relying solely on outsiders, the Albanians could operate with a level of discretion that would have been impossible otherwise. These local recruits were unaware of the full scope of the network. They saw only a fraction of the operation, which made the entire system harder for authorities to penetrate. As the network expanded, the Albanians began to control multiple layers of the supply chain. They identified weaknesses in rival gangs and used subtle pressure to redirect dealers and couriers into their own operations. Some members of competing groups were quietly absorbed or persuaded to work under new management, often without realizing the significance of their decision. The Albanians' approach was methodical. There were no dramatic takeovers, no public confrontations. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, like water slowly eroding stone. Within a few years, entire territories had shifted under their control without a single headline-making incident. Technology became another key tool in their expansion. Encrypted phones and coded messages allowed them to communicate securely, even across different parts of the city. Bank accounts and money transfers were carefully structured to avoid raising suspicion, and profits were reinvested strategically to strengthen the network. Each step was planned to minimize exposure while maximizing efficiency. Unlike other gangs that often acted impulsively, the Albanians relied on information, timing, and coordination to execute their plans. By 2008, their presence in London's drug trade was no longer invisible to those paying close attention, though most law enforcement agencies were still unaware of the scale of their operation. The network was sophisticated enough to operate almost like a corporate organization, with distinct roles, responsibilities, and a clear chain of command. Even the smallest couriers or street-level dealers were part of a system that extended far beyond their immediate neighborhood. Through careful observation, strategic recruitment, and meticulous planning, the Albanians had established a foundation that allowed them to expand quietly and effectively. Their network was strong, adaptable, and nearly invisible, a hidden architecture that would soon underpin one of the most disciplined criminal operations in London's history. By the time outsiders began to notice, much of the groundwork for an empire had already been laid, setting the stage for a transformation of the city's drug trade that would be both unprecedented and nearly undetectable. By the time the Albanians had established a stable network of contacts and couriers, they began the subtle process of taking control of London's drug trade. Unlike many criminal groups that relied on violence to assert dominance, their approach was methodical and invisible. They did not stage overt confrontations or engage in public showdowns. Instead, they used patience, strategy, and influence to absorb struggling gangs and quietly expand their reach. Their method was simple yet effective. They identified weak points in rival organizations and exploited them without drawing attention. Smaller gangs, often already struggling with internal conflicts or financial instability, were the first to feel the quiet pressure. These groups initially viewed the Albanians as harmless outsiders, merely another set of dealers operating on the edges of London's criminal landscape. However, over time, key members of these gangs were persuaded to join the Albanian network. Some were offered better financial incentives. Others were subtly intimidated by the knowledge that resisting would be unwise. Unlike other gangs, the Albanians avoided unnecessary violence, which helped prevent retaliation and maintained a low profile. Territorial control, which was once fiercely contested through street-level clashes, began to shift without anyone realizing it. Neighborhoods that had been dominated by chaotic local gangs gradually fell under the influence of the Albanians. Couriers and distributors, previously independent or loyal to other groups, were slowly integrated into the network. By the time rivals recognized the change, much of the power had already shifted. This quiet, almost invisible takeover created an illusion of stability on the streets, while in reality, the balance of control had fundamentally changed. One of the key factors in their success was discipline. Every member of the Albanian network had clearly defined roles, and rules were strictly enforced. Street-level operatives were trained to follow procedures meticulously, ensuring that no mistakes could expose the organization. Shipments were tracked carefully, transactions were controlled, and communication was kept secure. The combination of order and discretion allowed the Albanians to operate more efficiently than any rival group, giving them a clear advantage in both profit and influence. By 2010, the Albanians controlled several major supply routes into London. They had cultivated relationships with suppliers overseas, ensuring that their distribution networks remained consistent and reliable. Meanwhile, their street-level operations maintained a facade of ordinary activity. Residents might see familiar faces on the corner, but the real organization behind the scenes was far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone could have imagined. This ability to remain invisible while consolidating power became their trademark strategy. Their rise also reshaped the market itself. Prices stabilized under their control, supply chains became more efficient, and enforcement risks from minor participants were minimized. Many dealers preferred to work under the Albanian network, recognizing the order and structure it provided. This professionalization of the trade, combined with their careful expansion, allowed the Albanians to create a dominant yet quiet empire. By the end of this phase, London's drug trade had been fundamentally transformed. What appeared to be ordinary street activity was now part of a larger, organized system controlled by a disciplined and strategic group. The city's criminal landscape had shifted without dramatic confrontations or media attention, demonstrating that the most powerful operations were often the ones that could move silently, reshaping an entire market from the shadows. As the Albanian network solidified its control over London's drug trade, it began to innovate in ways that set it apart from other criminal organizations. While many gangs relied on traditional methods, street-level transactions, visible violence, and unpredictable operations, the Albanians approached crime like a business. Every movement, every decision, and every interaction was planned to maximize efficiency and minimize risk. They were not just participating in the trade, they were transforming it, introducing strategies that few in the city had seen before. One of their most significant innovations was the use of technology. Encrypted phones and secure messaging applications allowed members to communicate without fear of interception. Instructions were coded, locations disguised, and shipments tracked with precision. Unlike chaotic street-level operations that often relied on face-to-face meetings, the Albanians could coordinate complex activities from a distance, reducing the likelihood of exposure. Even when law enforcement conducted raids or monitored suspects, the organization's technological sophistication made it difficult to trace the full extent of their operations. Money laundering was another area where their innovation was apparent. Profits were moved through a combination of offshore accounts, shell companies, and seemingly legitimate businesses. By integrating these methods into their daily operations, they created a financial network that masked the true scale of their wealth. Unlike rival gangs whose sudden displays of cash often drew attention, the Albanians remained financially invisible, making it harder for authorities to link them to the crime scenes or street-level activity. The structure of the organization itself was a departure from the norm. There was a clear chain of command, with defined roles for every member. Street-level dealers were trained to follow strict protocols, couriers adhered to specific delivery routines, and managers monitored operations to ensure efficiency. This hierarchical structure ensured that mistakes were minimized and accountability was maintained. Even small errors were corrected quickly, preventing exposure and maintaining the smooth functioning of the network. Logistics were handled with an almost corporate precision. Drugs were packaged and transported in ways designed to avoid detection. Shipments were divided into smaller loads, often disguised within everyday goods, and routed through multiple locations before reaching their final destination. This reduced the risk of large-scale seizures and ensured a continuous supply chain. Unlike other gangs that risked their entire stock in a single transaction, the Albanians spread their operations in a calculated manner, making them more resilient to police intervention. Their professional approach also extended to recruitment. New members were carefully vetted for loyalty, competence, and discretion. They avoided recruiting impulsive or unreliable individuals, understanding that even a single mistake could compromise the entire network. Once recruited, members were trained to operate within the system, understanding the rules and expectations before being allowed to participate fully. By innovating in technology, finance, logistics, and organizational structure, the Albanians elevated their criminal operations to a level unseen in London. They created a system that was efficient, discreet, and difficult to disrupt. Unlike other gangs, their empire was not built on fear or violence alone, but on strategy, discipline, and foresight. In doing so, they transformed the city's drug trade into a highly organized network, setting the stage for dominance that was as invisible as it was powerful. Despite their meticulous planning and careful operations, the Albanians' growing influence in London's drug trade eventually attracted attention. By the early 2010s, law enforcement began noticing patterns that hinted at a larger, more organized presence than previously assumed. While minor arrests were occasionally made, the network's true strength remained largely intact. The gang had built a system that was both resilient and adaptable, capable of absorbing small disruptions without compromising the larger operation. Even as authorities investigated, the Albanians continued their expansion, operating with the confidence of those who knew they were steps ahead. The first major threat came in the form of a financial investigation. Police analysts had begun to track unusual money flows, suspecting that certain seemingly legitimate businesses were acting as fronts for illicit activity. However, the Albanian network had already anticipated this possibility. They had designed their financial system to appear ordinary on the surface, spreading funds across multiple accounts, shell companies, and offshore entities. Tracing the money back to the core organization proved to be a complex and time-consuming task, one that frustrated investigators and allowed the gang to maintain its momentum. In addition to financial scrutiny, law enforcement also began targeting distribution networks. Minor arrests were made, mostly low-level couriers and small-time dealers, but these actions had little effect on the overall operation. The Albanians' hierarchical structure and strict protocols ensured that any disruption at the street level could be quickly mitigated. Shipments were rerouted, replacements were assigned, and communications continued with minimal interruption. For every arrest, the gang had contingencies, demonstrating a level of foresight that most rival groups could not match. The sophistication of the Albanian operation was becoming apparent even to those inside law enforcement. Investigators realized that the gang's strength lay not in visible power or violent intimidation, but in invisibility and organization. Unlike other criminal groups that relied on fear and spectacle, the Albanians avoided attracting attention, making it nearly impossible to dismantle the network without extensive, coordinated effort. Their use of technology, encrypted communications, and compartmentalized roles created layers of security that shielded the leadership from exposure. Despite the challenges, the gang's response to this pressure was calm and calculated. Rather than panicking or retaliating violently, the leadership adjusted operations to minimize risk. Routes were changed, contacts were rotated, and sensitive information was restricted to only the most trusted members. This adaptability ensured that even as law enforcement tightened its investigation, the network continued to function efficiently, almost as if nothing had changed. This first major confrontation with the authorities marked a turning point. It revealed the Albanians' ability to survive external pressures without losing control or compromising their objectives. While other gangs might have faltered under similar scrutiny, the Albanian network thrived, proving that its strength was rooted in discipline, planning, and the ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. By the time police realized the scale and sophistication of the operation, much of the empire had already been solidified, demonstrating that the most dangerous criminal organizations often operate not with violence, but with intelligence, patience, and an almost invisible hand guiding their actions. By the mid-2010s, the Albanian network had become a master at exploiting London's unique vulnerabilities, turning ordinary aspects of city life into opportunities for their operations. While other gangs relied on force and intimidation to maintain their presence, the Albanians used observation, timing, and subtle manipulation to expand their empire. Their understanding of the city was meticulous. They studied the flow of people, the rhythms of neighborhoods, and the patterns of law enforcement to identify where they could operate with minimal risk. This strategic approach allowed them to embed themselves into the city's fabric without attracting the kind of attention that would threaten their network. Nightlife and entertainment venues became essential tools for distribution. Bars, clubs, and late-night shops provided perfect covers for their activities. Couriers could move discreetly among crowds, deliveries could be made under the guise of legitimate business, and transactions could occur in plain sight without raising suspicion. The Albania's operations blended seamlessly into the city's everyday life, masking the scale and sophistication of the empire they were building. To an outsider, these were ordinary establishments serving customers. To the gang, they were critical nodes in a highly organized network that spanned multiple neighborhoods. Recruitment was handled with similar precision. The Albanians avoided violent enforcers and impulsive recruits, instead targeting locals who had no prior criminal record. These individuals were easier to train, less likely to attract police attention, and could operate in communities that outsiders might find inaccessible. Members were carefully vetted for loyalty, competence, and discretion, and once recruited, they were given clear instructions and responsibilities. By compartmentalizing the operation in this way, the leadership ensured that even if one member were caught or compromised, the rest of the network would remain secure. The gang also exploited London's complex logistics and transportation systems. Delivery routes were mapped to minimize encounters with law enforcement, and shipments were divided into smaller, manageable loads that could be transported discreetly. Packages were often disguised as everyday items or moved through multiple locations before reaching their destination, reducing the risk of seizure. This attention to detail allowed the organization to maintain a steady flow of product across the city while avoiding detection. Financially, the network continued to operate with remarkable efficiency. Profits were laundered through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and carefully constructed shell companies. Every transaction was designed to appear ordinary, masking the true scale of the operation. This financial sophistication allowed the Albanians to reinvest in the network, expanding their reach and consolidating control over key areas of London without alerting authorities. Their methodical approach created a dual effect. The city's streets appeared calm and orderly, while underneath, a highly organized criminal enterprise thrived. Rival gangs often underestimated them, dismissing their low-profile methods as weakness. In reality, the Albanian strategy allowed them to dominate without overt confrontation, quietly absorbing territory and influence as they went. Their combination of strategic recruitment, logistical planning, financial acumen, and subtle manipulation made them nearly untouchable. By exploiting the city's vulnerabilities, the Albanians not only expanded their operations, but also reshaped London's drug trade from within. What looked like ordinary street activity was, in fact, part of a carefully orchestrated system, controlled with precision and discipline. The network had become an invisible empire, a silent force that moved through the city with the confidence of those who knew every street, every loophole, and every opportunity. London's criminal landscape had been altered, but few outside the organization could see the full extent of the transformation. Even the most disciplined and carefully constructed organizations are not immune to internal tensions. And by the mid-2010s, cracks began to appear within the Albanian network. After years of quiet expansion and meticulous control over London's drug trade, some mid-level members began questioning the distribution of profits and the hierarchy that placed absolute power in the hands of the leadership. While the street-level operations continued smoothly, behind the scenes, disagreements over territory, authority, and rewards started to simmer. These tensions, though invisible to outsiders, threatened the stability of an organization that thrived on order and precision. The leadership, aware of the potential dangers of internal conflict, acted quickly and decisively. Any challenge to authority was met not with public displays of violence, but with subtle, calculated enforcement. Those who questioned decisions were reminded of the network's rules and their obligations within the system. In some cases, dissenting members were quietly removed from operations, reassigned to less critical roles, or, in extreme circumstances, eliminated from the network altogether. This approach maintained control without drawing attention, ensuring that the internal power struggles did not become visible to law enforcement or rival gangs. Despite the occasional friction, the internal tensions also served as a test of loyalty and efficiency. Members who demonstrated discipline, discretion, and competence were rewarded with greater responsibilities and access to more lucrative operations. Those who failed to adhere to the network's rules were marginalized. In this way, internal challenges acted as a filtering mechanism, strengthening the organization by reinforcing the importance of obedience and reliability. The leadership understood that the survival of the network depended on maintaining a carefully balanced structure, where each member knew their role and the consequences of stepping outside it. The Albanian network's internal tensions also reflected the pressures of rapid expansion. As the organization absorbed more territory, recruited more members, and diversified its operations, the complexity of management increased. Coordinating activities across multiple neighborhoods, ensuring secure communications, and maintaining consistent financial flows required constant vigilance. Any lapse in oversight could have jeopardized the entire network. The leadership's ability to manage these growing pains without disrupting operations demonstrated their strategic foresight and adaptability. Interestingly, the conflicts were almost entirely invisible to outsiders. Law enforcement remained focused on street-level activities and financial transactions, often unaware that internal disputes were quietly shaping the organization's evolution. This ability to manage tensions behind closed doors reinforced the Albania's reputation for discipline and sophistication. While other gangs might have collapsed under similar pressures, the network emerged from these internal challenges stronger and more resilient. By the end of this phase, the internal struggles had solidified the Albanian network's hierarchy and reinforced the mechanisms that ensured loyalty and efficiency. The organization had survived threats not only from law enforcement and rival gangs, but also from within. These tensions highlighted a crucial truth about the empire they had built. Its power was rooted not only in stealth and strategy, but also in the leadership's ability to maintain control, enforce discipline, and adapt to challenges. London's streets remained calm, but inside the organization, lessons were being learned that would ensure the network's survival for years to come. By 2020, the Albanian network had quietly cemented its dominance over London's drug trade, leaving a lasting mark on the city's criminal landscape. Unlike other gangs whose influence was often measured in violent headlines and visible turf wars, the Albanians operated with a subtlety that made their empire nearly invisible to the public eye. Streets that once seemed chaotic and unpredictable now ran under the quiet order of a highly organized network. Their presence was felt not through fear or spectacle, but through efficiency, reliability, and the steady flow of product across the city. The network's longevity and success were rooted in its ability to remain unseen. Law enforcement agencies, while aware of growing Albanian influence, struggled to dismantle the operation. Its structure was compartmentalized, its communications encrypted, and its financial systems designed to appear legitimate. Arrests of low-level operatives had minimal impact on the overall operation, as the leadership and critical members remained insulated from exposure. The gang's resilience demonstrated that true power in the criminal world did not always require violence or intimidation. It could be achieved through discipline, foresight, and control over information. The Albania's influence extended far beyond street-level distribution. They had reshaped the city's supply chains, introducing logistics and organizational methods that rival gangs had never encountered. Couriers were carefully trained, shipments were strategically routed, and financial transactions were meticulously planned. By transforming chaotic street trade into a system resembling corporate operations, they created a model that was both profitable and sustainable. Even rivals who attempted to challenge them found themselves outmaneuvered, unable to match the combination of strategy and discretion that defined the Albanian network. Their impact was also cultural, changing how local dealers and small-time criminals approached the trade. Many preferred to operate under the Albania system rather than risk the unpredictability of independent operations. Prices stabilized, supply chains became more reliable, and the risk of violent disputes was minimized. In a way, the Albanians had professionalized London's drug trade, turning what was once fragmented and chaotic into a controlled, efficient market. Despite their control, the Albanians remained careful to avoid the pitfalls that had destroyed other empires. They did not flaunt wealth, engage in public violence, or draw media attention. Their success was invisible to the average Londoner, yet it was profound. The network's operations were a reminder that the most powerful criminal organizations often move quietly, reshaping entire systems without anyone realizing it. By the end of the decade, their empire stood as a testament to discipline, strategy, and foresight. London's streets appeared calm, but beneath that surface, a sophisticated and highly organized network thrived. The Albanians had not only survived the challenges of law enforcement and rival gangs, but had used those pressures to strengthen their organization, refine their methods, and expand their influence. Their story was a chilling reminder that crime does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it grows quietly, subtly, and almost invisibly, reshaping entire cities in its wake. Ultimately, the Albanian network's legacy was clear. They had transformed London's drug trade into an invisible empire, one that operated with precision, discipline, and ruthless efficiency. Their story illustrated a fundamental truth about organized crime. True power is often unseen, silent, and far more dangerous than what meets the eye. In a city as vast and complex as London, the Albanians had become a hidden force, quietly controlling the flow of drugs and influencing the underworld for years to come.